Hey, what's going on? Jeff Ratcliffe here. The Pittsburgh Steelers offense is going to look a little different this year with Antonio Brown out of the mix. So what does this mean for fantasy purposes? How does Brown being out of this offense impact what we should expect for fantasy purposes? Let's preview for 2019 fantasy football, the Pittsburgh Steelers. And I think we have to start with the obvious impact here on Ben Roethlisberger. Last year, quietly put up over 5,000 passing yards. I mean, if it wasn't for Patrick Mahomes, maybe we'd be talking more about what Ben Roethlisberger did last year. Of course, it was on 675 passing attempts, which is an enormous number, even in a pass-happy NFL of this era. So obviously not having AB is going to impact Ben. That being said, he still does have some receiving talent on this offense. We expect major regression in the yardage numbers. We're going to see very likely the passing attempts go down. They're still going to be one of the more pass-heavy offenses in the league, but those numbers are very likely going to go down. So that's going to impact Ben. However, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Sometimes in fantasy football, that's an overreaction. And some folks have moved Ben way out of their top 12 this year, which I do think is an overreaction. If you're viewing Ben Roethlisberger as like the number 15 or 16 quarterback, that might be a bit too far in the opposite direction. Well, I think he's more a back-end quarterback one because, like I said, it's not as if there's no receiving talent on this roster whatsoever. Of course, Juju Smith-Schuster coming off of yet another step forward. We saw a breakout rookie season, a step forward last year. That's going to help Ben Roethlisberger. And what it ultimately means is you're going to get him at a decent value on draft day. So let's talk about Juju. Last year, 111 catches. He was at a 25% target share. So seeing 25% of the Steelers' targets. Obviously, with Brown out of the mix, that leaves a gaping hole in the target share, right? They can't all go to Juju. That would give Juju like a 50% target share, which is unheard of. However, that being said, we would expect a little uptick. So maybe going from 25 to 27, 28%, which, don't get me wrong, those are massive numbers. Absolutely enormous target shares, especially when you consider it is one of the more pass-heavy offenses in the league. So that should certainly help Juju out. In fact, the interesting debate that we could have this year is whether or not you want Juju or Antonio Brown in Oakland. And right now in my rankings, I actually have Juju a tick ahead. I have Juju at 6, Antonio Brown at 7 among wide receivers in PPR. So just a slight edge there. He's in a good position to take another step forward, from an overall statistical standpoint. Juju Smith-Schuster is a big beneficiary here of Antonio Brown leaving. But the question is the other wide receiver, because we know this team, if there are that many passing attempts on the table, there's enough opportunity here to potentially produce wide receiver 3 numbers for whoever's in that number 2 spot. They're not going to step in and be Antonio Brown. We know that. I'm not going to go on here and say that because it's just crazy. But they could step in and see 16, 17, 18% of the targets. And if they do that, it's going to be hard for them to not produce top 40 PPR numbers. But the question is, who is that player? Early on it looked like it was probably going to be James Washington heading into his second season. A lot of upside and reportedly in very good shape after this offseason. But the team went out, they brought in Dante Moncrief after he spent a year of fantasy purgatory in Jacksonville. We saw him be productive in Indy, though he couldn't stay on the field earlier in his career. And then they went and they drafted Deontay Johnson, who, if you don't know who he is, look up some Deontay Johnson highlights. This guy can run routes with the best of them. He's a very interesting name. I don't think it's a clear cut, it's this guy or it's this guy. I think we're going to have to pay close attention to what plays out in Pittsburgh Steelers training camp to who earns that number 2 job, because whoever it is a guy who we should be targeting in the late rounds of our fantasy draft. So keep an eye on the Steelers. That guy, whoever it is, if it's Washington, if it's Moncrief, if it's Johnson, we're going to target them in the late rounds. Of course, Vance McDonald also should benefit, not necessarily just from Brown leaving, although some of those targets could shift McDonald's way, but also Jesse James is out of the mix. So it is McDonald's show now, and we've seen upside out of him in the past. Earlier in his career, of course, he flashed some upside, but then last year, he had 4 top 10 fantasy finishes. So this year, where we very much have a top-heavy tight end position for fantasy purposes, there's very few opportunities in the middle and late rounds to get a guy with major upside. McDonald right now is one of those guys. Now, you're not getting him in like the 14th round. Don't kid yourself. McDonald's very likely going to go in around about the 7th or 8th round of a 12-team PPR, but I think he's a very interesting player to look at in that range, given the offense, given how we've seen tight ends in that offense who aren't as athletic as McDonald produced in the past. He's in a very good situation to potentially break out in a big way for fantasy purposes. So keep him in mind, of course, at running back. We know James Conner's there. Last year, the huge surprise, nobody thought Le'Veon Bell was going to sit out the entire season, and he sat out the entire season. So Conner had the prime opportunity. And hey, a lot of folks didn't think he was necessarily going to be a 3-down back at the NFL level. He showed he can be a 3-down back. He was one of just 5 running backs last year to average more than 20 touches per game, so the volume was there. In fantasy football, at running back, volume is king, and James Conner saw a ton of it in this offense. He also, interestingly enough, did something Le'Veon Bell never did with the Steelers. He topped double-digit rushing touchdowns. Bell never did that in his years with the Steelers. James Conner did it in his first year of opportunity. So stepping forward to this year, you don't like the fact that he got hurt at the end of the season, but in the same right, he is in this prime position where he's very likely going to be a 3-down option again. He's not going to share the backfield with Jalen Samuels or the rookie they drafted, Benny Snell. Those guys are more reserves. If something happened to Conner, then you'd expect Samuel to be the next man up, then Snell after that. But Conner's in the driver's seat to see a ton of touches yet again this year. He's an RB1, every bit of an RB1, and it wouldn't surprise me if he went at the tail end of the first round of your PPR drafts. He might fall to the second, though. I like him in that range, late first, early second, all good in that offense. Plenty of opportunities for James Conner to pick right up where he left off last year. You want to see where Conner and the rest of the Steelers land in our fantasy rankings? You can check those out and more at PFF.com.